My name's Peter Nico. My personal background is as a soil chemist or an environmental chemist. Janie said I should talk about something interesting, so I will try to do that. If not, at least you have your beer. So what I'm going to talk about is basically some of the work we're doing with water resources. A lot of it is going to, whoops. Somehow it's slow. A lot of it's going to be California-centric because this is where we are, but it applies quite broadly to the western U.S. and to many other places around the world, particularly places that, like California, tend to swing between these two water extremes, between drought and floods, and our average year is never that. It's either one of these or one of those. So backing up to the very high level, this thing is really, there we go. See, yeah, it's really delayed. Anyway, this is a 2016 World Economic Forum looking at things that could happen of worldwide ideas and a graph of likelihood versus impacts. And water crisis, this is supposed to zoom out from this. Water crisis is way up here in this top of relatively likely and relatively high impact. So the scarcity of water globally is a major issue. So another way to look at it is by 2030, about half the world's population is expected to be living in pretty highly water-stressed areas. So there's a lot to think about of what's driving this. If we go to the more US side of things, and we look at projections of United States population growth. Some of these are pretty bad resolution. But so the total population growth in the US, broken up by areas, you see that the highest density of increased population is expected to be in the south and in the west. From a water perspective, in the west, this is water scarcity. The water perspective, the west is where there isn't any water. The weather is very nice because that's where everybody wants to live there, but that's not where the water is. So the south is maybe in a better position. But so we've got already western water scarcity. We've got a growing population that wants to live there, and we've got to figure out how we're going to manage these water resources going forward. Sorry, I got to get the hang of this thing. Okay, so this is looking at showing a graph of how and when areas get their water. So the color is saying the number of days for the area to get half of its water. So you see in this sort of yellow, red days, red is 10, yellow is 15. So all of this area gets about half of its water in 10 to 15 days a year. So that's like 2 or 3 or 4 2 or 3 day storms. So it's very, very flashy, which means we get a ton of water in a very short period of time. If one year we miss one of those storms, that's a significant fraction of that water. So this whole area is challenged by what do you do when you get your water in a very flashy way, but you want to obviously use it all year. Always a little bit suspenseful. Okay, so here's the climate part of this. There are things we know about climate going forward, and there are things we don't know. We know there's going to be less snowpack. Precipitation is going to come more as rain and less as snow. This is important for the areas of the country, the West, that uses mountains to store their water, because they use mountains to store the water as snow and give it to us later, which means the runoff off the mountains is going to change. So our water supply is going to change. We don't actually know that much about whether there's really going to be more or less water, at least for this particular area. So I'm sorry, these are pretty fuzzy, but here's North America, here's California, here's a series of models, a bunch of different models, saying how many of them say there's going to be more precipitation at a certain location, and how many say there's going to be less precipitation at a certain location. All the models agree that below here, there's probably going to be less precipitation. Above here, there's probably going to be more precipitation. This band, right where California is, it's 50-50, whether there's a prediction of whether there's going to be more or less precipitation. So we don't actually know whether there's going to be more or less water, but we know that the magnitude and timing and location of these storms is going to change. So this is a schematic of the current sort of western water system. Fall, winter, spring, summer, back to fall again. It starts to rain in the fall. So the blue line is when we get our water. It's raining and snowing all the way through the fall into the winter, and then kind of dies off into the spring and the summer where it's nice. The red line is when we use our water. So once it starts raining, people start to use more water. This is when the agriculture comes in. This is when everything happens. We use our water sort of peaking in early summer, and through the summer, it comes at different places. We need to build a water management system that has to bridge those gaps. We do it two ways. We count on the snow to melt and run off later, and we have storage. We gather it behind dams and such. One of the challenges of this graph is that those curves are moving. So this is when the precipitation is coming. This is the runoff from the Sacramento River, which is a major tributary in California. The red line is the average runoff curve from 1906 to 1955. This again goes October to September. It's peaking sort of at the end of March, beginning of April. The blue line is from 1956 to 2007. It's moving earlier because we're getting less snow, we're getting more rain, snow's melting faster, the water's running off sooner. Which means that these two curves are moving farther apart. Where we're getting our water and when we want to use our water are becoming farther apart, and it's becoming more of a challenge to span that gap. So just a quick thing about what do we do now for bridging that gap? And we have basically two main ways: behind dam storage and pumping groundwater. So here's the problem with dams. Although I have nothing personally against them, I don't know if anybody's seen Frozen 2, has young children. If it's a spoiler, the dam's kind of the villain of the movie. But there's a challenge we have with most of the dams we do, because we ask them to do two very different things. We ask them to be full as much as possible because we want to store water. And at the same time, we want them to be empty because we want to use them for flood protection. So it puts the dam, and more personally, the dam operator, into a very difficult position. So here's a vignette from, well, first, just on the California-centric stuff. If you don't know California, here's California Water 101. Here's California, here's the ocean, here's the Sierras, where all the water comes. Here's the Central Valley, where all the food is grown. Here's where all the people live. So half of the population of California lives below this level. And water is moved all over to supply that. And one of the places it's moved from is Orville Dam, which is up here. And there's a whole massive infrastructure to move water down to LA. So Orville Dam, this is the hydrology of Orville Dam a few years ago. So again, water year, June to September. This kind of light blue is the average level that Orville Dam is. It's a little bit lower in the fall. It fills up into the winter, and then it comes back down again. A few years ago, we're in the middle of a drought. This is the level of Orville Dam at October 1st. And it's just going down because it's not raining. But then it starts to rain, which is great. So you gather all that water, which is good. Then it rains again, gather all of that water. So we're filling up the dam, which is great. It rains again, it has a big storm, and it rains again, and it gets to this red line. So the red line is the legally mandated limit that the dam is supposed to be at that point in the year, based on the history of storms and how much flood protection space that they think we're going to need. So even though we need as much water as we can, we'll let some water out. And then it rains again, but we don't want that water anymore, at least not at this part of the year, so we let that water out again. And then it rains a lot, and there's a problem with the spillway. And right here, this top blue line is the maximum capacity of the dam, and it ticks just above it, which is not a good thing for a dam. So that's when 300,000 people get an evacuation order that the dam might, well, break. And that's an inherent problem, although it does all sorts of good things. This idea of asking dams to do both flood protection and water storage, and especially as that uncertainty increases, it gets to be a pretty tricky thing to do. So then this side, what about groundwater? The groundwater problem. So first of all, what is groundwater? Here's a cross-section of California. Sierras on one side, Coast Range on the other, Central Valley on the middle. Geologic time has eroded these two mountain ranges, filled the bathtub with gravel, and that has filled up with water. So groundwater is wet sand and gravel. It's not a big underground lake, which would be cooler seeming. It's wet sand and gravel, but there's a lot of it down here. It fills up most of the Central Valley in most places. We can pump it out, and then it naturally refills at a certain rate. We have been withdrawing the bank account faster than we've been depositing in the bank account for a long time now. So this is starting in 1962 is just an arbitrary point. This is the net, what we call overdraft, how much we've been taking out of our groundwater account as opposed to putting in up to 2002. You can see the blue line is all of California. The purple line is the Tulare, so the southern part of the valley. It's pretty much consistently down because every year we pump out a little bit more than we put in. And this causes a lot of things that are complicated, one of which, and potentially the most dramatic of which, is subsidence. So if you're not from the West and you haven't heard about subsidence, when you pump the water out, the ground drops. This is a famous photograph from the southern Central Valley showing where the ground level was in 1925 and where the ground level was in 1977. And that's a normal sized person. It's almost sort of believable that happens, but it does. And it's not just a old-timey problem. This is from 2014 to 2015, the height of the drought. 10 inches, this is red is 10 inches of subsidence, yellow is 6 inches of subsidence. This is the southern San Joaquin Valley. Things are dropping that fast. You know, if it all dropped evenly, it would be okay, because the planet being 6 inches shorter would be fine. But it doesn't drop evenly. And so things like roads and bridges and canals and all that don't like it when the ground starts to move. So subsidence is an issue with overdraft. Third time's the charm each time. Another thing is it takes a lot of energy. So this is energy used to move water as a function of the year. This is the energy that the state, in gigawatt hours, this is the energy that the State Water Project uses. So pumping water 2,000 feet over the Tehachapis into Los Angeles, the single largest user of electricity in the state. This is how much energy is used for pumping groundwater in the summer. It's a more complicated energy question because it's a bazillion isolated, sometimes diesel-run wells, but there's a lot of energy there. And obviously, most of the energy is in the lift of the water. The lower the groundwater levels go, the more energy it takes to bring it to the surface. So there's an energy part of this overdraft too. It is 3. And there's a water quality part of it. This isn't such a great graphic, but this is a 2-dimensional slice from the surface down into an aquifer where the red is showing basically the penetration of nitrate from surface activities and then uranium being released from the rock and moving down into the groundwater, and that's because it's being pumped out of the bottom and applied on the top. and it's moving those things down into the water. So you're degrading the water quality. So those are the three main things we don't. I'm just going to start doing this. No, it's okay. Just okay. So those are the big problems with groundwater overdraft. But what I'm going to get into, what we're working on, is really looking at groundwater and the potential for groundwater. One of the reasons we're interested in doing that is because, in spite of the overdraft issue, there's a lot of it. So this is a scale. Scale boxes show relative proportions of water. This is how much water is in the snowpack, about 15 million acre feet. That unit is what it sounds like. It's the amount of water to cover an acre of land in a foot of water, which is, if you're a farmer, is a very reasonable unit. For everybody else, it's kind of a thing we've inherited, but that's what we use. So this is 15 million acre feet of this in the snowpack. All the dams and reservoirs in the state are about 50 million acre feet combined. This is an estimate of how much groundwater there is. There's a ton of groundwater. That's somewhat misleading because we've already talked about how overdrafting that groundwater causes problems. So we can't just pump that out. But if we could learn to manage just one of these boxes by bringing water in and out in a controlled way better, we could store and use a whole lot of groundwater. So the question is, how can we move from just overdrafting to, yes, pumping, but putting in at the same way? So we've got a balanced, basically, bank account of groundwater. The challenge, though, is the rain comes sporadically. Again, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of hydrographs in California. You can see it's wet, and then it's dry, then it's wet again in the winter, dry in the summer. And even when it's wet, there are a few huge peaks. Those are our 5 to 15 days of water. So we want to take this water that comes in a handful of days and get it underground where it can sit for years so that when the next drought comes, it's there. So that's the challenge of how do you do that? How do you capture that water? And there's basically 3 ways to recharge groundwater. You can pump it down, like literally pull it out of rivers and pump it down. That's okay. It takes energy, and you only have as much capacity as you have the size of your pipes to put it down. You could have dedicated basins, settling basins. You dig a hole, you make a pond, you put water in that infiltrates. That works well too, and there's definitely a place for that. The problem is, or the drag is, that if you're only going to use those basins every 5 years when it's raining like crazy, you have to set aside a large amount of land that you don't really use it for most of the time. So something we've been working with others on and thinking about is, how do you use existing agricultural land and infrastructure to infiltrate water? So the idea is you have all of this agricultural land in the Central Valley of California. You have all of this infrastructure for moving water around for irrigation. Can you repurpose that to move basically winter floodwaters out onto the land to store that water? Okay, so here are the things about questions for on-farm water recharge. Where's there good land to do this? Not every farmer's land is good. Where will the water go once you put it underground? Someone wants to pump it back out. Where do you keep track of it? How long is it going to take to get there? How's it going to affect that water quality? I showed you those graphs about how water quality can change. How is it going to impact energy use and subsidence? And how much of our current and future overdraft problems can this work on? So this is really the area that part of my group or part of my division works on with the subsurface understanding, is how do we look into the subsurface to understand where the water is going to go and what's going to happen. So this is a very simple but interesting experiment out in Modesto, which is basically due east of here, a little bit south. Almond orchard in the Central Valley that was willing to flood their growers willing to flood their orchard in the middle of January. So it's cold, it's pouring rain, but we're going to apply water anyway and see what happens. So we're a partner in this. We're partnered particularly with UC Davis, which if you don't know is also a little bit east of here. They're a big agricultural school. Their team there is doing a lot of the tree health impacts, like is doing this going to impact the health of your orchard, because nobody's going to do it if it's going to kill their trees. And we're helping with what's happening in the subsurface. Where does the water go after it goes away? So this is an example of flooding the orchard in January and tracking the subsurface water movement. So one of the things we did is doing the geophysics, which is literally putting energy, in this case in the form of current, into the subsurface and using that to understand what it looks like underneath there. So you go through and you pound a bunch of electrodes into the ground, and you hook those all up to a wire, and you pass current between all the different electrodes and see how some places pass current faster. Places that are sandy and dry don't pass current well. Places that are clayey and wet pass current well. So between all of that, you can reproduce what's basically a map of the resistivity under the ground, but that tells you something about the potential water movement. So this is 25 or so meters under the ground, 170 meters along this transect in the orchard. And the red and blue at one side, red is basically indicating of drier, coarser materials, blue, wetter, finer materials. Where it goes solid blue down here is probably where the water table is at about 18 meters or so. And this is what it looks like before you apply the water. And the important thing, or the interesting thing that we're looking at here is you can see how heterogeneous this is. There's this one big red blob. So all of this area is not equally good probably for getting water into the subsurface. So come on. So now we did this. This is a static image. We can take the image in time lapse. So here's our cable running down the middle of the orchard. Here it's flooded. You can take images every few minutes for the next few days, and you can create a movie of where the water is going. Now this is supposed to be moving now. And you'll see as it starts to turn blue, damn it, Janet. Okay, excuse me. Okay. As the colors change here, as it turns blue, those are the areas that are getting wetter over time. So you can see the surface meter or so gets pretty uniformly wet because you've spread the water out very evenly. But below that, most of this area stays pretty dry. It's not really helping you get the water underground. Only really this one little bit of area where the sand is really what's funneling most of the water underground. So we can see that, and we can start to think about, now that we know that, there's a couple of different things. One, we can take that and put it into a computer model where now this is taking that same heterogeneity and simulating, it's a calculation of the water movement showing basically the same thing. And we can use that to ask questions that we want to know, which is, how are we going to optimize this? What if we apply 6 inches of water? What if we apply 24 inches of water? How are we going to do this with the least amount of work, the least amount of land, and the least amount of impact to the growers? So those are some of the questions that we're trying to help answer by doing some of these different aspects of things. So I'm going to jump quickly to a different, So I mentioned this groundwater overdraft. So in 2014, in the midst of the drought, California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which basically said you can't do this anymore. You don't actually have to stop doing it till 2050, but you can't do it anymore. Last state to regulate groundwater, when California is behind Texas in passing regulations, that's not usually the way it is. But in 2014,
Here, maybe you can double back to this later, but
Yeah.
earlier you showed a map of global where water is being impacted, and this groundwater depletion is happening globally.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, as I said, most of the western U.S. has groundwater depletion issues where it's not regulated. The whole Midwest, the Ogallala, thank you, aquifer, which really is the kind of the central third of the U.S., and definitely in most of the rest of the world that uses groundwater depletion is a major issue with all of the intended issues we talked about there. So California 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, you can't overdraft groundwater anymore. That's good. But here's the question: how do you do this? How do you monitor and measure groundwater at the regional scale, the basin scale, the natural unit? At the management scale, meaning the political units that are in charge of managing the groundwater, and at the project scale, say the people who are going to do the on-farm recharge or do the basins, and you want to do all of these things kind of with the same units, the same math, so that they're comparable, and you want to do it in a timely way. So there's lots of different, So the politics of passing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was local control. So that the locals would self-organize into districts that would control their water, and that those districts would then develop sustainable groundwater plans. This is an example of self-organization. The big box is the same geographic area. The 4 light blue outlines are 4 groundwater sustainability agencies that self-organized around the same area. There's the Madeira Irrigation District. That takes this area, I guess, and those bits. There's the County of Madeira that takes some other bits. There's the City of Madeira that wants to be its own thing, plus whatever that is. And then there's Gravelly Ford Water District that wants to be its own thing. So you don't have to be much of a subsurface scientist to think that's not where the water goes underground. Those are purely political boundaries, and that's fine. But we'd like a way to look at all of this at the same time and also be able to zoom into one particular point. So one of the ways we're doing this is, I talked about subsidence. When you take water out, the ground goes down. When water goes back in, the ground actually comes back up. In small ways, every year it comes up and down a little bit. You can measure that surface deformation on the scale of millimeters by satellite every couple of weeks, flying over and getting you the change in the surface to millimeter scale every few weeks. So we're going to look now at this Tulare Irrigation District, or the Tulare area, the southern part of the state of California. And here's what subsidence looks like over 3 different years. The blue bars are when it's wet. This is displacement in centimeters. You can see it's going down. The winter comes, it goes down a little bit less. Summer comes, and we pump like crazy, and it goes crazy down. A big winter comes, and it slows down and even turns up a little bit. So we can use these small changes, either good or bad, to then calculate how much water has changed underneath that area. So we can use those satellite images and that data to give us an estimate of this entire area. So this is a 90 kilometer by 90 kilometer area, and it tells you the volume change underneath that whole area and in each of those different pixels. And so that's a whole sort of regional basis. By using the same information on 3 different years on a monthly scale, you can see that in 2016 we were in drought and the groundwater is going straight down. In 2017 we had a ton of rain and the groundwater stays, maybe. So pretty even. In 2018 was sort of an average year, and it stayed pretty flat for a while, and then it drops off. So you can do it year over year. You can do it on a monthly time scale. You can compare different years, all with the same data and the same methodology in a uniform comparison. So, as I said, we can do it at this regional scale, this whole southern third of the California Central Valley. We can zoom down now. Now this is 20 miles by 20 miles to the Tulare Irrigation District, so that's a different management unit. They can look at what their water is doing using the same methodology. And then you can take, now it's really good. So that you can take, this is Tulare Irrigation District's, all their water infrastructure. So you can take where their ponds are, where their canals are, and see where the water is changing underneath to see which of these activities is really helping to recharge the water or not. So it's really a management tool, but it's the idea of how can we use the science and use the satellite and the subsurface information to help these different management levels talk to each other. So those are my vignettes. I'm going to end with this graph. We said we'd do a lot of different things. This is a schematic we developed to think about a lot of the different things that can happen in the subsurface. The area I'm involved in, the area is the organizing unit for the lab. We have a lot of different projects that are really about how do we take the potential of the subsurface. We talked a lot about this tonight, rivers and aquifers and aquifer storage, and think about all the different things that can happen in the subsurface and connect those more closely to the communities and the people living on the surface. Because besides, foundations and subways, we don't really use our subsurface for all that much. But there's a lot more potential there for the groundwater storage we talked about, for energy storage, and lots of different things. So I just put this up there as sort of an interesting way to stop and also to put some buildings in there because I know that's what you're actually interested in. Say again? I am done now that I got my new batteries. And so we can talk about whatever it is that anybody's interested in talking about. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wondered if you could go back to that one slide where you were showing the global.
Yeah. Now I can do anything. I think. So yeah, so this whole band through here, and then Australia, which is on fire.
Is the Southern Hemisphere pseudo-band, is that about the same?
I think it's about the same latitude. It's pretty symmetric by latitude. There's just a lot less land in the Southern Hemisphere at that latitude. But you can see that these are obviously huge population centers.
What's up with the gray area? Is that just dead zone?
So the desert, really, I think, yeah. So this is the Sahara. This is the.
No water?
I think, actually, it must be.
There's not so many people.
I think it. Yeah, I actually don't know exactly. I think it's probably that there isn't water, but there aren't people, either. Would be my guess. So.
So
Yeah.
India.
Oh, you're right. I guess.
In Mongolia.
Yeah. So I don't know what the gray means. Maybe it's just the next color down from the red.
Severely
So.
affected, as is China.
Yeah.
And how far does that red band stretch into the interior of the U.S.?
So this is basically, really roughly, here's the Mississippi here. So it's, the whole western 2/3 of this country. Yeah, so, sorry. Sorry, someone over here is trying to say something.
Sorry, Peter. Has your radar picked up any other areas in the country that's dealing with water shortages? Like, I know Georgia and Florida are in litigation on water use.
Yeah, I don't know much about the details of basically the issues on the East Coast. I mean, the technology and the satellites and the process would be the same and could do the same things, but I don't know much specifics. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry.
I heard a rumor, I don't know if you can clarify it or not.
All right.
Is California really thinking about doing a coal-fired desalination plant?
Not that I know of, no.
Maybe you want to mention for your desal.
Yeah, so I mean, on the desal side, not explicitly coal-fired, but I suppose you can plug it into anything you want. I mean, the lab did just, or the Department of Energy just funded the lab, our lab and several others to do a whole program on basically next generation desalinization technologies to get them lower energy and more importantly to get them more specific. We can talk about desal too, but one of the ironic things about desalinization is they're big trucks of salt that pull up to the plants every day because it takes all the salt out, and then you got to put some of the salt back before you put it in the pipes. So it's a pretty, it's effective, but it's a bit of a ham-fisted technology at the moment. Yeah.
How do you approach people on private land? So private property is probably a huge issue, right? And then also, you might be affecting profits, like you were saying with the farm. So how do you go about that whole process? Do you just reach out to people that you think might be welcome to it?
Basically, yeah. But I would say as the lab, that's not our forte. But where we can really tie in is like a lot of states, the University of California system has its whole land grant farm advisor agricultural extension system. And so those are the people who are out on the ground with the growers all the time. And so they're a very good conduit between the growers, what they're interested in, what they're worried about, the more academic side of things, and they make that connection. And so, yeah, most of the tests so far have been on growers who, for whatever reason, maybe they've owned their farm for a long time, so they're not, they've got a little leeway. They're like, yeah, I'm going to try this. You guys can come and do your thing on my land for a few years and see what happens. Yeah.
Does the water, it goes down, but it can also
Go sideways.
sideways, right? So
Yeah.
talk a little about how that.
So I didn't show. We have another set of images, but that I'll show on this. Wrong way. So this is the region of this field that's flooded. When we did our lines, we did one that went down the flooded region, and we did one that went across, that went from the flooded region outside of the flooded region for exactly that question. We can see there's a huge amount of water that goes down and turns left and moves out laterally once it gets below the surface, which again is one of the questions that's really important and why we're trying to increase basically our understanding of the heterogeneity of the subsurface. Because if you go back to those management districts, if you put in water here, it's not clear that you get to pump that same amount of water back up because it's not necessarily still there. So how you relate between these groups, and if you put in 2 acre-feet, do you get to pull out 1.5? Like what the accounting is really important and driven by the subsurface information. Yeah.
So I don't know if you went into this in any kind of depth, maybe I missed it. I know you mentioned about the bad stuff going
Right.
down as well as subsistence.
Yeah.
Now you're flooding and you're keeping water down. Isn't it going to carry it with it?
It is very definitely one of the questions.
You don't have any.
Well, I mean, I'm not talking about it here, but yeah, we've got other activities that is really looking at that because there's basically 2 categories of things. There's nitrate, which, for better or for worse, is a surface applied material, so it's actually relatively easy to control or try to understand what's going on with that. And then there's everything else, the arsenic, the uranium, the chromium, and all that kind of stuff. That's already in the sediment. And so a different project we're talking about is to say, what do we know about the chemistry of these sediments? Because we know actually quite a bit. And then if we can use the same types of techniques to extrapolate the chemistry of the sediments over space, we can say this area is more or less likely to have a problem if you change the way the groundwater is managed. It's not going to be perfect, but we actually put out a report that is supposed to be for practitioners to say, hey, if you're thinking about this, these are some things you might want to think about in your aquifer before you start changing stuff to see if you're likely to cause a problem or likely not to cause a problem. So, yeah.
Back here.
Sure, yeah.
Is there any, major policy that's up on the hill or anything, or for you guys in California, to try to govern the misuse of water with all the industrial sites? I know, like, it's a place by Mexico City, they're putting a thermal plant in, and they're gonna suck those aquifer dry, just leave all those farmers hanging.
Yeah, so for California, SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is the big lever, and that's the big groundwater lever. And
Chicago's not gonna give you access to Lake Michigan.
no, so no, we're going to take it from Oregon. They got a lot of water. So that's the big, for everything under the ground, SGMA's the big thing in town, and it says you can't overdraft anymore. California also has an archaic series of surface water rights, which are kind of insane, but they are the current law. Everybody talks about whether that should change. Most people agree that it should change, except for the people with really good water rights. But the reality of changing it, I don't know. Yeah.
So you're basically Sicily.
Basically Sicily. Yeah.
Yeah, forgive me if you mentioned this, but why not just build a bunch of big storage basins?
So there's a couple. There's several reasons. One is, let me put this. There's a lot of dams in California already.
Yeah.
All the good areas have been dammed. That's obviously you can always go someplace else, but there aren't a lot of really obvious good places. And dams are expensive to build. So this is actually, you can't see it very well. This is an estimate of thousands of dollars per acre foot of increased dam storage and groundwater recharge. So the infrastructure is expensive to put in. And then you can go down to, there's the ecological impacts, there's the political issues, there's this flood protection versus storage issues. So there probably will be some increased storage, like surface storage, but that is probably, it's probably a 20th century solution and probably not the 21st century solution. Yeah.
Is there parallelism between, say, dam water management, as you were describing with Orville Dam, with Army Corps of Engineers managing rivers, say the Missouri?
Parallelism, the short answer is yes, but what do you mean more? Give me more. Most of these red curves, these are Army Corps curves. So the same question of, as you're changing when your water comes, the management practices that are largely basically heuristics built up over time become increasingly less good for what you're going to do, because these curves are really just saying, on average, we've never had a bigger storm than this at this point in the year, so we're good. But as that changes, that becomes harder. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking about, but
Well, we now know that there'll be a 100-year
flood every
5 years.
yeah, exactly.
Peter, it's the same calculations they use for the levees in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so it works down there.
Yeah.
Bob has a question.
Yeah.
So last year we established that San Francisco was going to build a wall to stop climate change from flooding the bay. Why not just change that to freshwater and make it a storage basin?
to fill it up? Yeah, I don't think it would work, but you can try. Can you store fresh water like under salt water, you mean? Or yeah, be on top of it. But what? Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is the scale. It really depends on what you're going to store it for. So yeah, for scale for people and scale for ag are kind of a totally different thing. Yeah.
So obviously you got some key players here. You have, of course, the domestic use, you have industry, and then you have agriculture. So how are they all coming to the table to work this out?
Better or worse, some places. Some better and some worse. I mean, it's a big issue. I mean, there is just in California the politics of the central part of the state and the coasts of the state are fraught often. I mean, agriculture uses about 80%. Well, depends how you calculate it. The environment uses about half the water. Agriculture, of the developed water sources, agriculture uses 80%, and cities and industry uses 20%, roughly speaking, of how that's broken up. So, and everybody generally thinks that they're doing the best they can and somebody else should do better. So there's a big fight over it, basically.
So who's facilitating all this?
I mean, partly the state is through regulation, through passing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and saying you got to figure it out. And so these agencies, there's a process, and that's the reason why you don't have to be in balance for another 20 years, is the agencies are supposed to put out plans saying how they're going to do it, and in the end, the state is going to grade the plans and say either your plan passes muster or wrong, do it again, come up with a new plan. And so, yeah.
So what's going to happen between now and 20 years?
Yeah. You caught that, huh? There's the rub. But and this is whether you're in favor of or against it. The passage of the act was, politics is the art of the possible. Nobody was going to do it if you had to do it tomorrow, because it would be too big of a shock to the system, and nobody knew how to do it tomorrow. It's a big problem if you've been for 100 years overdrafting, and what are you going to do? So there's a lot of work being done on. And it's a very interesting time. Like, will land have to come out of production? If land does come out of production, what should it go into? Should the southern, and should you change crops? Because depending on where you calculate it, you may have to maybe pull 10% of your land out of production. But if you change crops on the other land, your economic impact is basically even, or maybe it's not. So it's all being sorted out now. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, sorry. Which way?
What percent of agriculture for the gross domestic product, that's grown in the United States does California account for?
It counts, so.
Yeah, look, we had a 100% number. The agriculture, that seems to be the biggest problem here. Is how much are they actually growing?
Yeah, so I got to be careful with knowing the numbers.
We're not going to hold you.
I don't know, but I'll tell you the things I do know. Except I am on camera. So a very large percentage of the specialty crops come from California, like upwards of 80% to 100% of some. So not corn, soybeans, wheat, any of that, but broccoli, nuts, fruits, tomatoes, all of that. Yeah, California produces often the overwhelming majority of those other commodities. So, yeah. But
I'm just wondering, what percent of agriculture does it account for in America? Like if the agricultural production was at 100%, what does California account for?
You mean financially? I'm not sure. As I said, if you think of it in terms of the things that are produced, it accounts for basically all the fruits and vegetables.
You got Mexico and everywhere else that can produce that kind of crop. Because if they're sucking down 80% of the water, that's the problem.
Right. I mean,
Eminent domain.
That must be dollars, not in pounds. Yeah, yeah.
So what I'm really trying to do is store the water deeper than the roots of it.
Yeah.
So on the first order, there's certain crops that can adapt to this, like almonds. But and probably some crops that would be waterlogged out and you can't do it. But if you could find a way to get the water past the root zone, then you'd have a better storage.
Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting things that are being done. We talked to some almond growers that are doing basically reverse tile draining. So if you're from the Midwest, you know that most of the Midwest has been tile drained because it's waterlogged. You put in perforated pipe underneath your field, and you drain that water into canals to get rid of it, so you can grow on top of it. That's the whole central part of the country does that. So now they're talking about when you're going to put in orchards, going to put in perforated pipe underneath the trees, and when you have water, you can pump it into that perforated pipe, and it'll go into the ground below the root zone. So it's basically a reverse tile drain. So that would be the idea, to do exactly what you said. You could skip the tree part, have it all happen underneath where you're growing. You'd have to pump into it. You'd have to connect all those pipes and pump into it. So it'd be someplace in between what we're talking about.
And is there any of the subsurface that where the water just can't go anymore?
Yeah, they're definitely, it's super complex and complicated. And so that's a lot of what I was trying to get at, is trying to understand where the water goes is really the key thing. Because if you look at, come on, I'm putting it the wrong thing. I want to show another picture, but Oh, this is the idea that really, if you think of what's underneath the subsurface, it's more like the vascular system of a person than it is like a layer cake. For old reasons, geologic reasons, there are ancient big gravel channels, and it's much more complicated. So we want to know where you can get the water in here. Yeah.
Oh, when you went back to the other heat map, you showed that red blotch.
Yeah.
It drained much better.
Yeah.
Is there any thought about, well, maybe that's where we ought to put a basin?
That's exactly the type of thing why we were doing this. You could either put a basin there, or you could tell a grower that if you've got this many acres and you want to set aside 10% of your land to do this 10%, not this other 90%, because you'll get as much water down over here as the whole rest of the land. Because it's going to go anywhere. So that's why this whole idea of the more we can understand what's below the ground, the better we can manage the water below the ground. Yeah.
How do you move the water there to the flooding? I mean, this is small, so you could probably do it in trucks, but ultimately, if you're doing large scale, you're going to have to move it with pipelines?
Yeah, this is where this idea that over the past 100 years, there's been a huge infrastructure put in to take water and move it around for irrigation in the summer. So you can use those same ditches and pipes and canals to move it in the winter.
Could you also inject it back into the well?
You could, yeah. And there are places that do that just literally pump out of the river and put it down. The nice thing about using land is that this whole idea that you're getting so much water over a small number of days, you'd really like to use a lot of land once in a while. But like the California, so this is, everything old is new again. So with the interest in using less water for agriculture, everybody's going to drip irrigation and things like this, and this is great. But the California Department of Food and Ag has said, if you have old flood irrigation infrastructure, don't tear that out. Because now you could use that same infrastructure, those same pipes, to maybe do this kind of water management, do your drip in the summer, and then use those canals in the winter to move water around.
How much is the drip irrigation saved in terms of water? Is it at a significant?
Oh yeah, it's like sometimes it's upwards of 90%. Like it's a huge applied water savings, and that's why everything new. This is this is the water rights thing. Anything new going in goes on drip or micro sprinklers now. People who have pre-1914 water rights, which means as much water as they can use, maybe they don't care as much. I mean, this is a whole other angle of that. A lot of people say, well, all you need to do is actually price water appropriately, and everybody will adjust their behavior.
Everybody will shoot you.
Well, yeah, that's that too, yeah. So I don't know how long I'm supposed to do this. I'm happy to, yeah.
Two questions. We just had a question come up. So price it appropriately and people will adjust. We say that about electricity.
Yeah.
So have you found that works with water, or is that kind of outside your scope?
It's way outside my scope. Okay. And, but it does work at some level in the sense that when people are looking at new water sources, certainly domestically, raising rates causes people to use less water. The devil gets into what is the appropriate price and how to sort all that out. But
Second question, just real quick, what got you interested in this in the first place and how?
because I'm from California and water's the key to it all. So, and I was originally from New Orleans, and there, you look up at that river and you think this is going to be a problem too. So I don't know. I don't know how to say it other than that. Yeah. Sorry.
Other questions?
I was going to make a comment, and it is all about money. So about 10 to 12 years ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and those who remember Jacques Cousteau, his granddaughter, water everywhere, not a drop to be found, watched the presentation. I was intrigued. I got so involved because I thought there was going to be a good business with it. And I started going after this, and that's where they had the Vegas. They actually diverted the water to Vegas, and they killed that town in Mexico. I mean, they literally showed the river 100% dry. You know what I'm talking about?
I'm not sure, but well, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not going to change until there's a massive problem and it becomes a world tragedy. Because we've already approached it, again, about 10, 12 years ago. You can't get anyone interested because there's not profit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an economist, but this idea of water markets, I think there's a lot of value in really figuring out how you're going to do that right. There's a lot of interesting challenges because water's super heavy and moving it around becomes complicated and all that. But I agree. I think in the end, there's a lot of what do you want to pay for? And that'll change people's behavior.
For it has to be a disaster. And
Right.
no one gets it yet. But it's coming.
Politically, it's a nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, the mafioso started in
Sleep
water, right?
for water. Yeah.
Yeah, and we screwed water rights up here, with Powell.
Right. Yeah.
Since we're on that, how do you equate climate justice and water? Globally, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think that's a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of complicated things there, which is. Well, I guess I'm not quite sure. All the places that are really dependent on snowpack runoff are really endangered for their water. And a lot of those places don't have a lot of money. And so it's definitely going to fall on the India and those sorts of places.
The Himalayas, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm thinking about. The Himalayas that supply water to such a huge population, as they stop supplying that water, the overdraft and things like that is going to just become that much more complicated. And so it's definitely the coming challenge is that, I think there's somebody quote is that water's the way most people will experience climate change. It's going to be in the water. Like the actual temperatures aren't as much, but the change in the hydrologic cycle is going to be the impact that most people feel first and most dramatically.
So, Peter, I have to say, this group has been going at it since 8 o'clock this
Yeah.
morning, and you're still
So,
questions. I'm gonna ask.
thank you.